this first session on slavery and capitalism, this has been something that obviously I'm very passionate about. It made up part of my studies as a race and culture student. And so basically, I just wanted to talk about slavery, share information. I have to say, I am in no way an expert. And I don't want to overload people, so I just wanted to kind of talk about different aspects of slavery. Putting this into context of why, it's very relevant to today. I would say that racism is on the rise in Britain, especially, over a period of time, using the narrative around issues on migration, immigration, refugees, asylum seekers. The Windrush scandal was actually going on for years and years before it actually came to the public's attention. There were a lot of violations going on for a long time. Like if you remember Joy Gardner in '93, that was a death at the hands of the immigration police. We've got like a climate crisis, climate refugees. There's a legacy of corrupt institutions and underdevelopment in many of the British colonies, ex-colonies. So we've got what is clear the world over, especially in Brazil, is that the end of slavery, decolonized or not, people of African descent the world over are still treated as less than human and are regularly killed and subjected to racism, both personally and institutionally. And so, this was organized before the incident and the outpouring in response to the disgusting treatment and murder of George, and now we're at a point where people are tearing down statues, and I feel this is a response to the whitewashing and the white supremacist nature of how Britain is represented, and this is part of what we're trying to challenge and address. So what I'm sharing with you today is also part of my journey, my studies, and how I've been able to make sense of the situation, reality for people of African descent. So the slide up on the screen just covers the different areas that I wanted to talk about. So I'm going to start with what was slavery and how did it develop. Okay, so I'm sure, obviously I don't know how much people know, how much people have read. There is stuff out there, some people haven't. But when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, obviously, there's the triangular trade, if you can see on the screen, but also the context of the papal edict that Portugal and Spain were very much at dominance at that time. And as this triangular trade started to develop, it was very much through royal charters and pushed by, the merchants. Like piracy was also a way that the British kind of pushed their way into this trade and domination in this area, because, like Portugal and Spain had the dominance. So piracy is kind of like an underhand way of doing that. So if we see that manufactured goods would be taken to Africa, they would be exchanged for human cargo, and then that ship would go across to we'll see on the next map, but the Caribbean, North America, and South America. But as slavery first started, it was very much, it wasn't like, let's start going to Africa and take black people and force them to work. There was harsh labour laws and conditions already in Britain, very strict differences in society, who had and who didn't. So you had the whole situation with indentured servants going out, doing their 7 years. And then, if you look at Eric Williams' book on capitalism and slavery, there's so much amazing detail in there. And he, for example, really tells you about, how the indentured servants were pushed, and the amount that there were thousands going out, but also there was kind of like an element of trickery. People were called spirits, and they would kind of like trick people to go to the new world, and children were often kidnapped. There was a lot of underhand behavior to kind of like entrap people. So, as things progressed, it actually isn't a surprise that certain underhand tactics were used, because those were being used here. So between 1654 and 1685, 10,000 indentured servants left just from Bristol. And in Pennsylvania in the 18th century, you had like 25,000. You know, and it was common for people to be kidnapped. If you think about sailing the ships, there was often press gangs that would go and scoop up people and take, you know, people from prisons, and you know, that kind of thing. So it very much was about using people's labor, but you know, people being powerless in that relationship. But at the same time, you know, 7 years of labor isn't the same as having a slave that you are going to get work out of for the rest of their life and be able to take their children. So as the trade developed, it actually became it actually became more viable to use Africans as slaves. So it didn't start out as that. That was how it developed. Um, where are we? I just wanted to say as well, like a year after emancipation, transportation, which was, you know, like a lot of people were transported to Australia, but also they were going to the New World. I just thought it was interesting that a year after emancipation, transportation was still a kind of penalty for trade union activity. And I just, you know, in the world that we're living in and how, you know, we're trying to build the trade unions, I think that is quite indicative of the time that it was. You know, obviously slavery went on for you know, centuries. You know, so it's hard to talk about the beginning and the end and talk about it in, you know, in order. But during the time of its development, I would say that the height of slavery was in the 18th century. But between, you know, like the 1640s and 1740s, there was so much change going on in Britain, so much political and civil disturbances that, you know, there was often people that were prisoners of war that were being sent out. So, for example, in Montserrat, we still got a very strong Irish element on the island, and a lot of those people were descendant from the prisoners that Cromwell sent out there. Then you had the religious Quakers as well, but also, again, if you look at Eric Williams, you know, he talks about how much corruption there was. If you were making money out of the slave trade, it was in your interest to make sure that more people were being sent out there, and that was quite endemic as well. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this slide just kind of shows you a bit more about the area. We often think that, you know, slaves just came from one particular place. And on this map, it doesn't actually show you the East African side as well. We're talking about transatlantic slavery, which went on for centuries, but you've also got the East African slavery with Arabs slaving Africans that actually still goes on today and has been going on for thousands of years. So there was some interchange with that side as well, but particularly with the Europeans taking Africans to the New World, these are the places that they were taken to. And if you see on that map, you can see how many, that there were lots of slaves going to South America. And I have to say, as a student of slavery, there's so much about South America that I don't know, that we don't know. But if you look at the society today, you know, there's so many descendants of slavery, and you know, right now, you know, there's a real issue of inequality in that society, and I would say that that is true across South America. You know, like we know North America too, but South America, I would say that it was quite marked. Where are we? Okay, so these are just several pictures of the journey. Okay, so if we talk about where, like, so slaves were being taken, African people were being taken out of Africa, and as that started, there always had been slavery. There always has been slavery in this world in different ways, but the transatlantic slavery is of a particular nature. Excuse me. And I would say the aftermath of that has been very specific to that trade. So in other cultures, slaves could marry into the family, you could own land, you had freedoms, or after a period of time you could have your freedom. Whereas this particular form of slavery, so you just go back to the other slide. So it started off with, people going and making arrangements with different tribes and different chiefs, and like it was part of society. Then, as the need for more slaves increased, there was more shenanigans, more setting one tribe against the other, and then obviously you've got the development of the kidnapping, and like the people that are coming over to get slaves, they need to fill their boats. So it turned into something that became much more sinister and disgusting. And also, obviously different tribes dealt with Europeans in different ways. But for people that say, oh, Africans sold their own, like there was a concept of slavery, but as it progressed and it built up, it turned into something that was very destructive. And it wasn't a case of, oh, people are just giving off prisoners, or there were whole communities, children, women that were being kidnapped and taken. So again, the first picture on the right, people were marched to the coast. People wouldn't, people died on that process. Then you would be at the coast waiting, and again, you might. This is mortality rates. Then you've got people, the merchants, the traders deciding on who they're going to take, and then obviously people are going to be put onto the ships. And a big thing about slavery is the survival of the Middle Passage and the conditions that people were suffering at that time. Next slide, please. But also as well, just to say, because like for me, thanks. When we talk about slavery and the conditions of slavery, I think it's really important to put it into context of the conditions of the time. So this picture, obviously you've got lots of ships, lots of trees got cut down, people are being crammed in. This picture is obviously when people are having that time when they can come up on the deck. But there had to be violence and suppression to keep that number of people from, rebelling, revolting. There were many incidences when that happened. People would jump over the side, etc. So when we see this picture of how African people were, okay, I'll go to that in a minute. So what just came up on the screen. There's a lot of dispute about the figures of how many people were taken into slavery, how many people died during slavery. You have to remember that you died on the way to the coast, you died waiting to get on the ship, you died on the ship, or you jumped off the ship, or you might have been killed on the ship. Then when you get there, then you've got another dimension. The average life of, well, particularly Caribbean slave was 4 years. So 250 years is, I would say, a time when there was a much more of a concentration of enslavement, whereas the trade was over a longer period. It kind of built momentum and became more and more popular as it became more of a free trade. More people started getting involved with slave trading because like at first the royal companies would monopolize it, but as things progressed, many more people started involving themselves in that. So so if we go to the next slide, so there's a lot of questions about how many slaves were taken, how many people died, but that is just that I would say that is I can't think of the word, but that is a low estimate. So I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with this picture. If you count the people, there's like over 300 people in there. And obviously, that was a traumatic moment. If you've read Roots, if you read Olaudah Equiana's narrative, um, um, the books that Jeremy was discussing about slavery, that is a new narrative around that experience. But you know, there's various experiences about that. But if we imagine that that was going on over 250 years, you know, the conditions are just unimaginable. But the thing as well is, if you were transported or an indentured servant, although you weren't crammed in tightly and you wouldn't been shackled, you didn't have much more space either when they were transporting people. So if people have got any questions or any contributions, please put that into the chat. One thing I did want to share with you, if you think about the boat, and you think about the amount of people packed into that boat, you think about people being shackled, and then you realise that it wasn't until 1779 that the clock was invented that meant that longitude could be accurately mapped out on the charts. So for me discovering that, I just felt how many times did ships get lost or run into rocks and lose their cargo, and you know, people are down in the hold. So, you know, when we're talking about the life lost and the trauma of that passage, like really is unimaginable. We go to the next slide. Okay, so obviously, when the ships landed, there would be various sails. On this particular flyer, we've got 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls. So if you do the math, what's that? 90, 96 people. But the picture that we saw, there were up to 300 people crammed into that boat. So at this sail, I'm not saying that they came off the ship, but you know, part of packing people in so that you had a cargo at the end. So it was like the loss of life was factored in, which is actually quite horrific. There's also another flyer like this, and it tells you that there's going to be a slave sale, and Lucy is for let, Lucy to let. Yeah, so she's being basically rented out, which is just, you know, unbelievable. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Zong. I mean, or a lot of people probably have heard of Granville Sharp, and the Zong was one incident that he was involved with, and basically the captain of the ship had packed the ship so full, and then they were kind of stranded, and so the captain basically threw quite a large portion of slaves overboard because they didn't feel that they were going to get where they were going, and so that he could claim the insurance, he basically murdered the slaves. Okay, but when the ship when the ship came into dock, it was questioned. No, sorry. When the insurance claim was made, it was contested, and it basically was found that the captain of the ship had enough provisions on board the ship to not have to do that, and so he didn't get insurance. But the fact that that was challenged, you know, I would say that you know, that wasn't normal practice, and we don't know how many people were like thrown over the side for those reasons. But when we're talking about, you know, the financial side of slavery and all of that, like the fact that, you know, people were being thrown overboard and lives were lost and they were being able to be claimed back for insurance is you know, like, it's deplorable. But you know, obviously it's easy for me to say that is how things were at the time. But if we're looking at the actual experience of slavery, the dehumanization of African people and being seen as a commodity, you know, this is very deeply rooted. So for me personally, when I hear someone like Boris Johnson saying, of course Black Lives Matter, you know, it kind of conjures me back to the time when, you know, people had us as property and saw that as, you know, a benefit to them. Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the differences in slavery. So obviously there was plantation slavery. Like, so we think about the Caribbean. In North America, like, I have to say, I don't know, as I haven't studied a lot about South America, and I know that a lot of the information about South American slavery is in Portuguese and it's kind of coming out, but there's still a lot that we know. So I'm referring specifically to North America and the Caribbean. So in North America, um, at the beginning, you know, when you're coming out of Jamestown and Virginia is developing, and you know, it's a vast continent. Slavery in North America, I would say the ratio was more 50-50, and you had more smallholders that had slaves. This is at the beginning, yeah. Whereas in the Caribbean, you didn't have 50-50, you had like 10-1. So slavery was much more brutal. The instrument of control and punishment was much more brutalized, much more regulated. So, for example, people talk about Barbados as being Little England. Barbados was like the island where the British really refined their slavery. After, you know, um, getting the sugar process from the Dutch, and obviously there was a lot of fighting within European, so like the Spanish, French, English. I was going to say European powers, but this, you know, they were building their power at this time. So there was a lot of fighting amongst themselves over the islands. So, for example, 1655, Britain managed to take Jamaica, been under the French, under the Spanish, but they had Barbados, and they'd really developed the slavery in Barbados, and they'd, you know, had the black codes that were just unbelievable codes of how you kept your slaves in order and how you know, what you were able to do to punish them. So, for example, in the black codes, if you killed your slave out of malice, you were fined £15. But if it wasn't out of malice, you weren't fined. So, you know, that on its own is just an indicator of the kind of codes that were in place. Obviously, you had forced, well, you were not allowed to read and write. It was illegal to read and write. So if you were found reading and writing, that was punishable. So when Britain got Jamaica, which was a bigger and topographically a different island, but it was very rich, and it was, you know, there was expanses for the plantation. Britain brought the codes from Barbados, but because of the differences in Jamaica and how Britain was developing as a slave trader, Jamaica was like an island where slaves were broken in. So it was very, very violent, very repressive. And, you know, even slaves from other places taken to Jamaica to be broken. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of like when we talk about slavery, there's very different aspects around it. So Caribbean was very much, I would say, was very much more brutal, although slavery was brutal in general. In America, I would say from the 1810s going through, that was when we started having real large scale plantation being developed, especially down in the South. So for example, when people talk about being sold down the river, like that was a real phenomena in America. Like, you know, like there was like a massive surge in establishing the plantations and filling them up with labor. So whereas you had communities that had, you know, a chance to kind of consolidate and accustom customized themselves to the lives they were living, descendants of Africans living in America as slaves, then you had this kind of mass migration, forced migration, 10s, 20s, 30s, 1830s, in America, and that again turned into a much more brutalized form of slavery. You know, and I would say a lot of the remnants of that kind of deep-seated, disgusting racism, you find that much more evident down in the South. Okay, so obviously, you know, the sugar was in the islands. We know that cotton was a large produce that um, was being grown and harvested. Tobacco, that was as well, but from some of the reading that I've been doing, tobacco was seen as more of the arena for a lot of the white workers, the white laborers. Okay, so you know, sugar, the actual process of sugar was, you know, really intense and grueling. You know, there are stories of people being pushed into the boiling sugar in punishment. You know, there's been instances where people have actually, you know, like basically committed suicide. So, you know, like the harvest of the sugar and the intensity of that, life on a Caribbean island was very different from what it would have been in the USA. Okay, as I was saying, as we came into the 19th century, that was when you had much more large-scale plantations in America. Okay, to what extent is slavery covered in British education? Okay, I would say they do cover it. I think it's in year 8. I don't actually teach it. It is part of the history curriculum. Obviously, it's quite simplified version. Obviously, you know, if you're teaching year 8, you can't really talk about the brutalities of slavery, you know, that were real issues at the time. You know, like, can you talk to year 8s who are year 8s are 13, 14? You know, like if we want to think about rape was a massive part of slavery. You know, is that appropriate for us to be talking to year 8s about that? I don't, as far as I know, there's nothing about slavery in the GCSE, but the impression that I get from talking to people is that slavery is very much kind of taught in a way that, you know, it was done to us, and we were very much oppressed by it. There's no kind of discussion on, you know, how we survived rebellions, uprisings. You know, like in general in British society, we associate abolition with William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp. You know, we don't. So the way that we are being taught about it is still being very much kind of whitewashed from a white perspective, as in, you know, that one of the fundamental aftermaths of this and abolition and the long-term impact is the dehumanizing of African people, and then supported by, you know, the colonial era and pseudoscience, that, you know, there is an inferiority. And so that hasn't been addressed in how slavery is taught. It's not taught in a way that, you know, we're all equal. It still comes across as us and them. Okay, I'm just seeing any more questions. How do we get this into education? Right, okay, we'll come to that. Okay, so David says slavery in Brazil was enormous, 10 times the number of Africans transported there as to South to North America and Caribbean, and not abolished until 1888. No, definitely. Like, yeah, I mean, the amount of Africans that went to South America is like, well, he's saying 10 times. There's still so much that we don't know about that. But what I would say is that there were more opportunities to run to freedom and build communities than there were in other places. So obviously, people have heard of the Maroons in Jamaica, and that was possible. People went up into the mountains, but it depends on the geographical area that you're in. So in South America, you've got massive plantations, but what you find is that you've also kind of got communities that were the same as the Maroons, and they were able to build their own communities out of that. But that's not diminishing in any way the fact that it was massive, went on for so long, and there's still so much that we need to find out about it. I remember being taught about slavery in year 8. I think the teacher just played Roots on TV, and that was it. Now, I wasn't allowed to watch Roots, but when I have seen some of Roots, it's shocking. The first thing that I found the most shocking was the fact that it was the father from the Waltons who was the slave trader. Like, that was just mind blowing. But just the kind of the way that they did it, like often dramatizations use the essence of the book. And I would say that Roots was a very Americanized, sanitized version. It really is worth reading Roots. Like, it really takes you there, and that is just one person's experience. Okay, hold up. Okay, some councils are taking down all these monuments to slavery. Do you think there's a danger of being tokenistic, avoiding genuine social change to tackle excuse me, that still exists under capitalism today? Yeah, I mean, personally, really, can I bring that question? I'll come back to that question at the end, because I don't just want to. I would like to hear what other people have got to say about that as well, so we can put that question forward. We can come back to that, because that very much is about where we go from here, how we move forward. How important slave trade. Right, okay, so how important the slave trade was in driving the development of the British capitalism. Well, we're going to come to a bit more on that, but I would say definitely it's obviously fundamental. If you want, what do they say? You have to spend money to make money, and if you've made all this money, then now you've got funds to spend money to make more money. And then an independent country. So for other slaves in other places, that it was possible, and there was a motivation. So then we come to Sam Sharp in 1831, 32. Often people call that the Christmas Revolt, so it kind of went over from one year to the next. Again, it was unsuccessful, but the brutalization of the slaves and the executions that followed that were very much fed into the abolition movement that by that time was, had momentum in Britain. So when we talk about slavery, we need to acknowledge the fact that it wasn't the white folk that abolished slavery. And that's a whole other question, because you had the insurrections, the uprisings, you had the abolition movement. But then you also had the development of the economic system, which also kind of comes into play. And I'll come back to that a little bit more. Go to the next slide, please. So I don't want people to think that, it's just all about the men. There were women that were fierce and stood up. So, for example, we have Zinga, who's a queen I love to talk about in Black History Month, and would like to be able to talk about it all the time. She was a princess in Angola when the Portuguese were trying to push in. If we go across to the other side of Africa for a moment, Kilwa, 1504, an amazing, world-renowned city, center of trade. Portuguese razed that to the ground. So, like, if anybody here has heard of Kilwa, I'll actually be surprised, because I think I've maybe met one person that's actually heard of it. So the Portuguese were coming over to Angola, trying to get slaves, and Nzinga fought for years to keep them out. I mean, they did push in eventually, but she was very much a leader and very fierce, and defending her people. So next one.
Is it? Are you in? Yeah. My phone is messed up.
Next slide, please. Okay, so then we also have Nani. I'm sure many people have heard of Nani. And she came from Africa. She came with her brothers as well. And she was able to run away. And so there was a community that was created called the Maroons. Like, time is short. Please, if you don't know about Nani, please feel free to go and look about her. Like, there was major incursions with the British. They forced the British to sign a peace treaty. There is some talk, they used to hand in runaway slaves, but for many years, there was guerrilla warfare, and they held their independence. So, like, Nani is a Jamaican national hero, and there's many stories of Nani, and her her prominence as a leader, but also at this time of slavery, where you've taken people, stolen, kidnapped, violated them. You don't let them speak their language. You don't let them practice their religion. You don't let them read and write. How are you supposed to have knowledge of yourself, cultural knowledge, if you have been born in the islands? You just know what you've been taught. So, someone like Nani was really powerful, because she came from the motherland, and she knew her culture, she knew her history, she was connected with her ancestors. So, she was very powerful. If you go to the next slide, please. Okay, so before I go on to Equiano, I just wanted to say I do have a reading list. If you look at Angela Davis, Women, Race and Class, there's just, she discusses the different writers around slavery. Like John Blazingham, for example, he wrote about the slave community, and that was a book that I really enjoyed, because it wasn't just looking at us as slaves, it was looking at how we survived, how the family basis, how people out to support each other. If you think about Sam Sharp in the 1831 uprising, that was very much about the community. Some people call it the Baptist Wars. There's a book by Mary Turner, The Baptist Wars, which is really interesting, and it kind of shows you how the networks within the Baptist Church, and also using the Bible. If you see Jamie Foxx plays Sharp. Anyway, Jamie, I think it's Sam Sharp. But he plays him, and he very much quoting the Psalms and reading the Bible, and like the whole issue of Christianity. There were issues about whether or not you introduce slaves to Christianity, and if you do, then they're more human, and there was that whole debate around that. But those slaves that were given access to that, very much applied to the situation. And so it was like there was often like that kind of divine motivation and element to that. But what I was trying to say about Angela Davis is that she really talks about the experiences that women had. Like, women were treated the same as men. Like, if you were going to get lashed and you were pregnant, they would dig a hole so you could lie down and still get lashed. Like, people would have babies, and their babies would be at the end of the line, or they'd be at home with the children. And like, if a woman's had a baby and she's not with her child, like, her breasts are full of milk. Like, but women still had to they still had to work, and you've got the whole sexual violation of women, and that legacy of, you know, a black woman as property, and, you know, be that the mercy of the master, and, you know, the fact that if there was children involved, that child would inherit the mother's status. I was also reading about, you know, the amount of women that actually abort their own babies because they just couldn't bear the thought of bringing a child into this world to live in those conditions. And, you know, if you had a girl child, you knew what was going to happen to them. So, you know, like, I think when we talk about slavery, like the experience of women, and, you know, if you think of like the kind of development of feminism, the role of the woman, like black women were very much excluded from that. But we were very much there and instrumental in all parts of resistance and rebellion. So, coming on to Olaudah, so I'm sure people have heard of him. He's African. He was kidnapped when he was 12. He managed to save up and buy his freedom, and he became a prominent abolitionist. Again, often dismissed, left out, but his book, which we'll have a look at, was very much at the forefront of the abolition movement. And also, as well, a lot of people talk about Frederick Douglass, but Frederick was a bit younger. Olaudah, so Frederick was more prominent, I would say, after 1833, going forward, whereas Olaudah was very much pushing from the start of that movement. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so yeah, so he was taken out of West Africa, and he ended up in Barbados, and then so often, you know, people come and then take you to North America. So he ended up in Virginia, which, whether people know or not, is, you know, at the heart of American development of slavery, like kind of moved out from there. And then he was bought by a naval officer, so he traveled the world. He came to England, he got to see different sites, meet different people. One of the ways that he was able to save up and buy his freedom was by buying things at different places and then selling them on. You know, so he was kind of like building capitalism, buying and selling and making a profit. And so by the time he was able to get his freedom, go to the next slide, please, he had taught himself to read and write. And, you know, you hear about this often. I don't know how someone teaches themselves to read and write. I was fortunate. I was taught to read and write quite young. But it's a real skill for your intellectual development to have that, which is why it was deprived from the average slave. Becoming a Christian, he would have been engaging with the Bible and, you know, kind of those social values that were very prominent at the time. So he did have that kind of moralist view of slavery being wrong. So Olaudah, he actually was the first African to write a narrative of his experiences. And so in 1789, he published this book, and people were so shocked because, you know, by that time, lots of people were benefiting from slavery, you know, like industrialization was developing, had their wealth that they were, you know, reinvesting. So it was a big part of society, but it was easy for people to benefit from something that they didn't really know about, because unless you actually went to the island, you saw for yourself, you know, like you would be getting a sanitized version. Like the people brutalizing and violating the islands aren't going to come back and give you full detail of what happened. They're more like to say, oh, these people are grateful that we've given them the opportunity. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that whole element of we're doing Africans a favour started to build momentum as well. So Olaudah's book was kind of like, it really opened up to people with real experiences. So he made many speeches on abolishing slavery, and he in fact presented an anti-slavery petition to Queen Charlotte in 1788. Go to the next slide. So again, I'm not an expert. I don't know everything, ins and outs, and all the finer details. But I do know that Queen Charlotte, if you look at her, this is a picture of Charlotte from Ivan van Sertima's Black Women in Antiquity, and she was of German and African descent. If you look and see Charlotte in the National Gallery, she's wearing the white wig and her face is all powdered white, and she doesn't look black at all. But and Helen Mirren played her in The Madness of King George, but she actually was mixed race, German and African descent. And at that time, around that time, in North America, Louisiana was a colony of the French, and there's a book called The French Quarter, and it actually talks about prominence of country women down in New Orleans, and how it was kind of like the center of the aristocracy. It was commonplace for a gentleman to have a country mistress who he would house, and like she often had more rights than the wife did. So it was like at the same time as this trade is going on, people being brutalized, at the highest echelons of society, you have this kind of adoration that is based in Africanness, but it's kind of like the mixture between the two. So again, like that kind of deep-seated anti-black, blacks are inferior, it came after, okay? And that's the picture right there of Charlotte. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, so what's the time? Okay, so yeah, so this is just from Olaudah's books, worth having a look at. Just click it one more time, please. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, so Olaudah comes across as also called Gustav Vassa. I'm not sure if people know. Someone said his sister, but I read it was his daughter. I heard that Olaudah Equiano's daughter is in Hackney Park Cemetery, which I think is like, wow. And also, if we look at the Unitarian Church, if you look at the green space just outside, you look at the trees, how old they are, like Hackney, Samuel Pepys, that kind of just far enough out of the city to be able to be radical thinkers. Anna Barbauld lived up the road. Like Hackney, I do think is really part of that kind of that abolitionist questioning, like what do I say? Like radical thought. Yeah, you've got Mary Wollstonecraft coming out of this area. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's his daughter in the cemetery. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some other prominent people that have kind of been lost on the way as well. So that's just an interesting fact for Hackney. Like Hackney is very much, I would say, connected with the history of that movement for change and challenging that outrageous, disgusting behavior. Okay, so we see the picture, movement for abolition. So obviously, slaves over the whole period, African people were fighting for their freedom. Yeah, and then like the Quakers, religious movement, like so Wilberforce. I just found this out. I don't really know much about Wilberforce, but Wilberforce apparently was the representative for York, and that included Sheffield. And Sheffield has kind of got a real history of supporting the abolition movement, particularly through the women. I'll show you a picture in a minute. But if we see the gentleman on the chair here, this is his back from lashes. This is untold lashes, like the scourge. The scourge is the use of the whip to control people. When we hear about Enoch Powell talking about the black man getting the upper hand of the whip, like, what are you saying? Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, so the whip was very much the instrument of control and the violation. And it's not about us getting the whip hand over you. It's about throwing the whip in the field. Or out, do you know what I mean? Throwing it away. So Am I Not a Man and a Brother was a very, I'd say, fashionable logo. I know Wedgwood had it and made it into pottery. Still some around today. Go on to the next slide, please. But you know, there was also Am I Not a Woman and a Sister? You know, and I have felt like that before. Like, am I not a sister and a comrade? Like, do you know what I'm saying, amongst women? So we had female abolitionists. So we start with Sojourner. Sojourner Truth. Some people may know her, some people may not. She actually got a child that was taken into slavery back and sued and got her child back, which is unbelievable. Obviously that was in the 19th century. But she was very much about speaking up for women. Often the abolitionists and, you know, African men were talking about themselves, and she was like one voice that was not afraid to remind people, you know, am I not a woman and a sister, and do, you know, we work as hard as you do. So then bottom left hand corner we've got Mary Ann Wilson, and like I was saying, Sheffield has got a real kind of like tradition of anti-slavery abolitionism. The women of Sheffield went on strike and refused to make shackles. We've got Harriet Tubman. I'm sure most people have heard of her, but you know, his sister, soldier, spy during the Civil War. You know, led many slaves out. I know there's a new film that I haven't actually seen, but you know, if you're interested, like, she's really worth having a look into. Excuse me. And then we have Then we have Mary Prince. Now, I have to say, I had heard of Mary Prince, but I didn't know she was the first black woman to petition Parliament. Like, I didn't know that. And we don't, and all of the books that I've been pulling out and digging out of my shelves, I can't find anything on Mary Prince. So, you know, if we talk about curriculum changes, we should be learning about Mary, because she was a slave in Bermuda. Bermuda's still a British colony. Like, that in itself is I find that absolutely shocking. Anyway, so Mary, this is a picture of her when she was younger. She was very much at the forefront. She managed to escape, come to Britain, and like I say, she petitioned Parliament. So, you know, often the narrative is about the men, and it's often about the white men, but you know, we very much have been involved. Now, there's a new there's a play that came out. The author was on the news the other day, and I just wanted to show you a clip from that. Right, the right slide, Akura? Yeah. Okay. Right. So this is just the space. There's a picture from the time. You know, but when William went in and made his speech, like, there'd been a movement for a long time, and there'd been many things that were done, and Olaudah, for example, was very much at the center of that, you know, speaking across the country. And so I think it's a shame that, you know, William kind of like gets all the glory, although, you know, obviously we appreciate it, but yeah, there were other people involved. All right, so I just want to show you a quick clip.
My name is Juliet Jilts Romero. My new play, The Whip, unravels the untold story of how the abolition of slavery was finally achieved. I sat down with the show's director, Kimberly Sykes, to discuss what happened.
So the play begins in 1833 in the House of Commons as they are debating the factory bill, which is reducing the number of hours that children are required to work. And we meet this extraordinary man called Alexander Boyd, who's fighting for the factory bill.
Lord Mayborn arrives and basically gives Lord Boyd, Alexander Boyd, mission impossible. Whip MPs into agreeing an abolition bill and a way to get out of slavery through delivering a compensation fund to the slave owners. The 1833 Slavery Abolition Act formally freed some 800,000 colonial slaves who were then the legal property of Britain's slave owners. The contributions to this act from social reformers, including William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, are relatively well known. What is less well known is that the same act contained a provision for the financial compensation of the slave owners for the loss of their property. HMRC released a tweet on a Friday, fun fact, telling the public that they had been helping to pay off the compensation paid to the slave owners. Anybody who was working up until 2015, their tax money went into this. The government essentially mortgaged future generations. There are a number of forgotten figures in the popular narrative surrounding abolition. Among them are freed slaves and runaways. My character, Mercy Price, mirrors the life of Mary Prince. She became the first black woman to petition Parliament on the subject of emancipation. Debbie Corley, who plays runaway and abolitionist Mercy Price, joined me to talk about her character. Tell me about Mercy Price.
She's an incredible human being, a human being that has endured, toiled, but still stands tall.
So I based her on Mary Prince.
Yes.
And as we know, unfortunately, Mary didn't live to see abolition go through, so I wanted to dramatise her. How much did you know about Mary Prince before we started doing this?
Well, truthfully, Mary Prince, I knew that she existed, but I didn't know quite how much she'd done for the abolitionist movement, quite how far she'd campaigned. The fact that she was the first black woman to write a petition and gather so many people from the UK up and down, and then go to Parliament and say, you know, we need to stop this. I can't imagine the bravery for her to step inside a space like that and say, you know, this is something that needs to be stopped.
I have been a slave. I have felt what a slave feels, and I know what a slave knows. And I would have all the good people in England to know it too. I am often much vexed, and I feel great sorrow when I hear some people in this country say that the slaves do not need better usage and do not want to be free. They believe the foreign people who deceive them and say slaves are happy. I say, not so. How can slaves be happy when they have the halter round their neck and the whip upon their back?
There's part of her autobiography where she talks about being put in a marketplace with her family, and one by one they're all just separated, and that heartbreak I can't imagine. But again, this was a woman who was made of such strong stuff, and to go through something like that but still fight for so many other people, there are no words.
Of course, the past speaks to the present, and social historian Professor Les Henry says the shadow of slavery exists today. Professor Les, we're stood here outside the House of Commons, a seat of Parliament and democracy. It's amazing to think that actually Mary Prince was here and handed in a petition to fight for the abolition of the slave trade. How significant was the passing of the 1833 Abolition Act?
It was significant in the sense that it ended chattel enslavement or African chattel enslavement. But to me, if we want to really think about it, we have to think about some of the other drivers that were happening that got them to that point. There's a complex history there that I think people need to discuss.
So I've been walking around and I saw the Buxton Memorial in the park, which commemorates Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, who, as we knew, boarded slave ships and collected information. But it doesn't commemorate the grassroots abolitionists, and certainly not the black ones. What can you tell us about?
Because I believe it says, is it William Wilberforce and others?
Yes.
Well, it's the others who are important, and especially in the context of Mary Prince, who is Mercy Price in your play.
Yeah.
Here is an African woman, an ex-chattel slave, presenting in the House of Parliament, and not only presenting but articulating herself in a fashion that actually stirred and moved people in there. We don't hear anything about the Africans, who resisted, transcended chattel enslavement. And I think that when we talk about Wilberforce's others, the others need to have a seminal voice, and you give the others a voice in your wonderful play.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm nearly finished up, and then we're gonna have a bit of time for question. I'd like to have a bit more of a discussion, really. I'm happy for other people to contribute. So where are we? So if we're thinking about so there's a few things that I still would like to know about. So for example, like obviously as slavery started, it was the royal charters, and then there was a movement towards more free trade, and I personally would like to know more about the English Revolution and how much that was motivated by kind of breaking that monopoly, and like the monopoly of the king, and kind of like opening it out for more people to be out there trading and benefiting. So after the revolution, like coming up to the end of the 17th century, like there was a real surge in free trade, and then like Adam Smith did his Wealth of Nations 1776, like UK England has like the North American colonies taken independence, but it was like it, from what I was reading, it wasn't as devastating as you might think it would be to Britain to lose that colony, because how the nature of trade was changing. So particularly, within the islands with the sugar, like the monopoly was becoming a problem. So as the abolition movement grew and more people learn about the like the actual conditions of slavery, it was also coupled with a need for change. So part of what Adam was presenting was how you organize your labor, and the overriding ideology was that it would be more economical for slaves to work for wages, a low wage. Cheap wages were standard anyway, but like the expenditure of housing and feeding and clothing your slave, if you change the nexus of exchange to selling your labor for a wage, then you need to work because you need to survive, because you're no longer being paternally cared for by your masters. So it was like that kind of like came along at the same time. So as much as people want to say, oh yeah, Britain ended the slave trade, or there was abolition, slavery was ended, yes, it was ended, but the actual outcome of the reality of that was that it wasn't like fundamentally it wasn't any different from what slavery had been. You might have stopped taking people across the sea, even though that carried on. South America was still quite happily trading in slaves and slavery until like almost the end of the 19th century. So, when we think about abolition, it wasn't just about freedom for African people. It was the end of this form of labor exploitation to be replaced with another economic system of exploitation. And so when we think about like the capitalist world economy that we have now, is very much based on the writings of Adam Smith. if you think of the years preceding him being able to, you know, create that treatise, you had the trade that has enriched the country, is enabled people to develop and come up with the mechanisms and you know, mechanisms of industry. You know, so things to do with farming, agriculture, and then like the processing of the cotton in the mills. So it's like, and if you look at the whip, I haven't seen it, but just kind of looking at some of the work around it, what it's about, it very much does connect with the plight of laborers, like the you know, the people that don't own the means of production, that are forced to sell their labor to get their income. There's very much a connection with that, and I think the whip really explores that. So, you know, like the way the children were signing a 10-year apprentice and working for free. They were working in disgusting conditions. So when Mary Prince came and was you know, meeting with other people, they were white working class factory workers that you know, they had that solidarity. Like, talk about, you know, where we go from now, it is about re-establishing that solidarity, because it is about labor, it is about the conditions of our work. But because you had a system of slavery that was able to be demarcated between white and black, when the abolition movement was rising, the plantocracy were the class that owned the plantations. Many of them were absentee owners, you know, and then when you look at who's in Parliament, what their commercial business interests were, Parliament was very much a place where those people catered for their own needs. So there, at the time of abolition, I am confident enough to say that there were people that were up for abolishing slavery, but not necessarily because they wanted Africans to be free. It was just more economical to go into a new phase of how you exploit labor. So hold up, can you just go back one slide, please, Ekoa? Sorry. So it was more, so the stereotypes based on the plantocracy propaganda, like, I don't know if people have heard of Edward Long, James Wolvin, Black Ivory, he talks about some of the most disgusting behavior. There's many diaries, journals, you know, there is stuff out there, but Edward Long is kind of like a notorious, cruel, plantocratic propagandist for kind of, you know, pushing that image of Africans are lazy, promiscuous, this, that, and the other. You know, how are we lazy? The wealth for our labor, that actually doesn't make sense to me. But, you know, there was this massive assault. You have to remember, the plantocracy was the wealthy. They had the power, they had the money, they had the ability to distribute information. So there was a lot of propaganda, and a lot of that propaganda is kind of like still remains. It's at the basis of a lot of things. And then when you think about the colonial era that followed, and the kind of pamphlets and the way that people, others were represented, it very much fed into a narrative that kind of, you know, otherized others. But also, because you've had this legacy of slavery, it's easy to have the white and the black. So, you know, this is coming from hundreds of years. So it's the dehumanization of Africans has been institutionalized. Yeah, and if you just look at the other things on the slide, you know, this is the legacy of what has come after. This is not why it happened. Yeah, this is just the aftermath. We go to the next slide. All right, thanks guys for staying with me. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we were just gonna, so the legacy of slavery in a capitalist system. So again, the money, the funding, that is what enabled that progress, that development to happen, but also to protect it and sustain it. White supremacy has come to the heart of it, whether that was the intention or not. That is the outcome that we are now living in. So when you have, you know, like those of the South North America that wanted to defend slavery. And you've kind of got that upper class elite that made their money from it and didn't really want it to end in the first place. Like, you're going to protect your status and your power. So by the fact that you gained that power at the expense, it becomes about being white supremacist, European supremacist. Yeah, I hope people get that. Okay, and then again, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, but how did you get the wealth in the first place? And then this has been developed and built upon. And we know that, you know, other countries have been sabotaged, you know, industries have been destroyed, countries have been underdeveloped, like all of their raw materials, like, you know, and I'm sure people know about these things, but this is part of the legacy of how slavery has enabled the capitalist system to do that. And that leaves us with an intrinsic inequality in the international economy up to today. Use of black people to pop up the system from the bottom, the underclass, the lowest paid jobs, the worst housing, the worst educational outcomes, because you're living in an area where you're going to schools that are the least funded. It's like, that's okay for you to be at the bottom, even though we need you to be here. That's your place. And so think of post-war migration, think of the situation in this country in the 70s. It's like it's institutionalized for us to be at the bottom. Even though we fight and we succeed and we rise, we're still fighting an institutionalized oppression. And again, as we know from the last 3 weeks and from all of our lives, there's a continued violence and state-sanctioned oppression towards people of African descent, whether it's not teaching us the truth, or whether it's not giving us medication that is suitable for our homeostasis in biology, whether it is, deaths in custody, immigration. I could go on. So, and for me, and I'm happy to discuss it if you don't agree, for me, that is the legacy of slavery in the capitalist system. Okay, do you want to put up the next slide? We'll come back to that. I'm going to finish, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about reparations, and then I was going to finish with a poem. Okay, so can we take away the shared screen, please? Okay, so Adam, you were asking about the statues. Do you want to unmute yourself and come in?
Yeah, can do.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it's just obviously, when we first organized this talk, we didn't know this massive movement was going to take place, and it's very good timing in that respect, and everything you've just said is really great to have all this background to what is going on right now, and particularly with the fall of the statue in Bristol, the Colston statue. And we've seen over the last week, councils and Tower Hamlets down the road, they've removed this other slave trader, and places are being renamed and all this sort of stuff. Today you had the fascists out trying to defend other racists and imperialists in Westminster and stuff. Anyway, I guess my question was just, do you ever worry that whilst it's really great that this statues being brought down has opened up this conversation about all of this kind of imperialist history that we've got, and do you think in any way distract from the social issues that still exist today? You talked about the legacy of slavery as capitalism, and we see all of these racist systemic problems within capitalism today. The fact that BAME people are more have a higher death rate with COVID, for example, and that's clearly a social question in terms of the jobs that BAME communities tend to be put in, the dense housing, the living conditions, or all of these things of what have contributed to that death rate, and we're not really having that conversation. Like we're just seeing like these. I'm just worried it could be a bit tokenistic. We take down some statues, good. But then it almost seems like that's it, problem solved, where it's like, wait a minute, we've not even scratched the surface.
Yeah, no, that's a good contribution, because, you know, for me, pulling down a statue, well, there was one I wanted down, but that isn't the priority. The priority is that we can change things so that people don't keep perpetuating the same thing, and that we do make sure that those people are taught about in a way that we get a better picture of what happened. You know, so if we're going to talk about the people that have been pulled down from their statues, like, put it into context of what was happening. And that's what we need to be doing in education. So rather than pulling down a statue, let's change how we teach the children. Because, you know, like, obviously there's been a big campaign in Bristol for Colston to come down, but, you know, a lot of people wouldn't have heard of him, or if they're not in Bristol, don't really know about him. But the fact is that majority, we're thinking about children in school, they don't know how Britain developed and funded its industrial revolution based off of slavery in an explicit way, like it should be. So yeah, like, it's not about just bringing down the statues. It's about fundamental change. It's about actually starting to discuss and look at what racism is. A lot of people don't even know what racism is. They don't even know how they're complicit with it, or they don't really understand. And often that is supported by their lack of knowledge. So for example, whether you are aware of it or not, if on an unconscious level you think that you're better, or that Black people are there and you're here, if you have got more knowledge and understanding of what has happened and why things ended up like that, and what has been taken from us, like particularly our ancient history, our place in antiquity, then, you know, like, whether there's a slave trader up or not, people know who we are and where we come from, rather than constantly being represented and channeled into oh, you're this and you're that and you're underclass. Because there's lots of people out there that, you know, like, the oppression and inequality that we face, they think we deserve it, or it's because we didn't work hard enough, or it's because we didn't try hard enough, or, do you know what I'm saying? It's like, I don't think people actually really realise how many people don't get that job, how many people get turned down time and time again for promotion. Like the guy, the bank manager, there's an article, the police, because he was driving a nice car, the police had him on gun running, people trafficking, and fraud. He was a bank manager. Like, he didn't lose his job, but he lost his promotion. Like, the fact that it can be so easy for those things to happen. So taking down statues isn't, like, that's kind of like a symbol, but we need structural change going on. I just wondered, Diane, if you can I ask to unmute you? I just wondered if you wanted to contribute to that.
Well, just on the statues, I mean, I think the people in Bristol that toppled Colston, who was a huge slave owner. I mean, some people said, oh, he's a philanthropist, he did all this stuff for Bristol. He did it with money which was blood-soaked from the slave trade. And actually what they've triggered by toppling that particular statue has been more debate on slavery and the British role in the slave trade than I can remember for a very long time. And I think that is a good thing. And what's interesting about Lucie's presentation is it's speaking to that, our involvement in the slave trade. But I agree that the media and the Tories would like the statues thing to be a distraction, you know, Winston Churchill's statue and all the rest of it. And we can't allow ourselves to be distracted. But there's no doubt that sometimes direct action triggers a debate that we need to have. And we need to have a debate about Britain's role in the slave trade. There's all sorts of British institutions like Barclays Bank and so on, which were funded originally by the profits from slavery. And we need to understand more about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I know that, you know, there's people out there that the last thing they want is for us to have reparations, because, you know, I don't know if there's enough money in the world to pay back financially what you benefited. And I think that as far as reparations is concerned, like, it's not down to me to say, you know, I want this amount of money. That would come from an examination, like pass the motion in Hackney North to have an all-party parliamentary truth commission on the impact of slavery on African people, and that would be where, you know, where we did look at Britain. I think that, you know, it's not, there is a financial element of it. If you look at underdevelopment, and I know John McDonnell was talking about sharing technologies, but for me, the money is not the priority. The priority is that you are facing up to the truth and the past. There's descendants of this plantocratic class still in Parliament right now that use the fact that they despise the fact that we have the audacity to bring these things up. Like that is real. So, you know, like, through the education system, through legislation, like, it should be enforceable and standard that, you know, the McPherson principle is used, for example. The Equality Act has no provision. It talks about tackling discrimination. It doesn't talk about tackling how that discrimination is perpetuated and allowed to be got away with, which is structural, institutional racism, you know. And there are a lot of people, like Darren saying, that would rather us be distracted on that, because, you know, there's a lot of people that start digging up their past, you know, there is a lot of dirt there. But for me, it's more about moving forward than kind of dwelling on the past. That happened, but we need to look at it in a way that is going forward. So, for example, we weren't enslaved because we're inferior, which is like the kind of way that a lot of people see it. We were taken as slaves because we were strong and able, and it was viable for the slave trader. I know that sounds bad coming out of my mouth, but do you know what I'm saying? Like, the world that we're living in now, it's like people think, oh yeah, they were slaves because they're down there. Whereas 3,000 years ago, you know, we had an amazing, rich, civilized culture that has been denied common culture. So it's like we have no credibility. We've been just left in history as slaves. Like, this is the thing. We should talk about ourselves as enslaved Africans, because we were forced into slavery, but we were never slaves. Echo, do you want to bring, in fact, Shez, do you want to speak? Shez, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to lower my hand so you don't call me back again. No, thank you for that, Sister Lucy. It was a really great presentation. I just wanted just to add on in regards to these statual removals and so forth, and the changing of the street signs. I'm if that's what they need to do to make themselves and think that we're going to feel better, that's all and good. But at the same time, we need to have investments into our community. I think that's the most important thing. What we need right now is investments in our community. And when I mean investments, I mean things in terms of our educational attainment, housing, health, and the criminal justice system. They have to look at the way how we've been treated in regards to deaths in custody. So that's another area. So there's things that they do need to do in terms of spending money, and I do not want a statue replace in regards where they're going to be put in, like one of my ancestors, or murals. We don't want that. We've been demanding for far too long now for change. We've been down this road for how many many years in regards to inquiries and top of inquiries, and nothing's changed. It's still the same. So I'm just asking for the past norms not to be the new norms, and the new norms to be a better norms, and that's how it should be for us going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Raj, do you want to come in? You got your hand up.
I think the downing of the Colston statue in Bristol did send a shockwave in the British establishment. All those people who are still inheritors of the slave trade must have been shivering in their boots. And it's created a momentum now that, I mean, to right or wrong, we must first understand the wrong. Slavery was wrong. Slavery was exploitation of human beings, and it was dreadful. Many people lost their lives, and people need to understand that if you're going to move forward, we need education. We need to bring this into the classroom. We need to educate our kids, and we need to rewrite the history. The history that has been written is institutionalized from the point of view, or not the victim, the conqueror or people. It's a distortion. Whether it was a slavery or British imperialism, history has been distorted. So it's important, and I was delighted when they took the statue and shoved it into the sea. I think all those statues should have the same fate. They put the slaves in the sea. This is where this statues belong. We need the establishment to government to understand. We have to get this right in order to move forward. Education is important, but one of the other comrades said we need money in an area, depressed area. We need an investment.
No, I agree. I really agree with you there. And like, if we're talking about reparations, I felt this about Windrush as well. Like, you do need to have investment in the community, intergenerationally. But I think for me, like in light of where we're at now, the polarization in this country, from Brexit to what's happening right now with people coming out to defend their statues, I want people to know more about slavery, but I also want the white working class to know how much we had solidarity, how much they were oppressed just as much as we are. You have just been suckered by the same elite that has been oppressing us all for centuries. Like, we really need to have that connection between us. Do you know what I'm saying? Because, like, slavery was a very brutal, disgusting thing, but there were many people that were living under similar conditions in this country. So when we talk about who benefited from slavery, we've got the established elites, we've got a whole working class that was created. If you look at, like the culture and society in places like Bath and how people benefited from slavery, but then you've also got the working class folk. Their descendants were press gang, they were sent off, they were in the factories working the longest hours. Like, the same day they were doing the abolition bill, they were trying to make it so that little children weren't being violated. Like people need to realize what things were really like, and that it's not about black and white, it's about the oppressed and the oppressors. And I really think that rather than kind of falling into that trap of it becoming a polarized, racialized debate, that we really, especially like if we're thinking about the Labour Party, we're thinking about how we engage with communities, think about how Britain does need to think about its past and not be afraid to look into its past and, recognize that, this nation was the biggest slave trader out of the lot of them. But part of the reason why it was the biggest slave trader out of the lot of them, it was one of the bruckest countries in the first place. So, like, we've got to be thinking about how we build a society where everybody benefits and not just a small proportion at the expense of everyone else. And for me, that is what is the most important thing about this, like the legacy of capitalist exploitation of all of our labour. Liz.
Oh, it's wonderful, Lucy. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Oh, wow, it was very educational. And education, I think, is the key to, education is the key to all of this. I think some of the statues, white working class don't know what they're for. Some of the statues are put up by the families of the people who've passed. It wasn't that they necessarily did anything besides leave them a bit of money in the pocket. But when we look at the buildings around the cathedrals, the art galleries, the universities, and the churches, we need to remember that all of those are built on the backs of slavery, as Diane said. I met a sister from Oxford, and we were talking about Windrush, and she said that she demanded Oxford's county council give them money for a Windrush event. And they said, oh, I don't think we've got anything to do with Windrush. And she said, have you not looked at these buildings here? You know, and Rhodes is one of the people that they're trying to build down. Thank you. I want to be there when they pull that one down. And my sister used the Guildhall. I said, why are you using the Guildhall? And she said, A, it's free. B, we've already paid for it. So whenever she did her Black History Month events, she'd said to the Guildhall, we want to use it. And they were sort of, they're really quite nervous. So, what do you want to do here? You know, she did a memorial to the Black nurse through the whole of October 2018. We need to use these spaces for our own history, but also for the history of all the other people in our community. Because even not only Black young people, but white young people don't know that that the grandchildren of slaves fought in the First World War as well as the Second World War, and that we've paid to fight in those wars. We had to pay
and
to
then
get off.
paid to pay off the slave traders. Like that is such a shocking fact. But
when you look at America after the slavery, there's several good books. I mean, Maya Angelou, I mentioned the one that she kills her daughter because she doesn't want her daughter to be a victim of the rape of the slave owner. But there's other stories where you may as well have been a slave because you had to give everything, including your daughter and your wife, to the landowner because you couldn't afford to pay the rent of the land that you
it was like that here as well. It was this is the thing. We kind of
Scotland and the Highland clearances, all of those places after feudalism,
right?
We were still in the British were still enslaving British people because the landowners kept the land, and we had to work it whether we liked it or not, whether we were Black or white, whether we were adults or children or women.
Thanks, Liz. I mean, sorry, because I need to bring someone in, and then
I'm glad that you put the sisters there, though, because that was something that I'm really pleased to see. And, and to show that we fought to get out of slavery as much as the Christians sort of tried
and
to get
our
out.
legacy as Black nurses in this country goes back centuries. From Mary, probably before that, but Mary Seacole, 1948. Up to today, like it is unbelievable,
and it hurts my heart that you see how we died during COVID. But thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
We must continue to learn and educate each other.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Liz, but I wanted to just bring Equia in, and I wouldn't mind just trying to take one other person, Amanda. After Equia, do you mind having a comment? Put up your thumb if you're good for that. Okay, Equia, do you want to go? And then if not, I'm going to ask Dan. He's got his thumb up.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and keep it sharp. There was 4 points I wanted to make. First of all, really useful, coherent flow in terms of the history of slavery and its impact. What I feel is most important about this, and is often missing from the narrative, is why that impacts on our lives today, on the attitudes of the institutions and of individuals. So that segue that you made through that, I think, is vital to this conversation. There's a couple of things I wanted to make note of. And though I think it's really important what you're saying about us looking at the sort of shoulder to shoulder in terms of Black people and white working class people in this country, we also cannot ignore that the actual labour movement So the change in conditions for white working people were actually paid for by the wealth of slavery. It was actually the fact that there was more money so they could give more leeway to the labour movement. So I'm not trying to disempower that, but I think we need to acknowledge that came, and also that the actions of people like Olaudah and other campaigners, actual black freed slaves campaigners, were the inspiration for some of those leaders of the labour movement in the UK. So that was just one point I wanted to make. I also wanted to make a point about the statues really briefly, but really importantly, I'm an artist. And I see the role of art in terms of our political lives, our social lives, and the way we think as being really vital. So to me, the pulling down of the statues, let it continue, is really, really important, which seems weird. The pulling down of art is really important because it's a significant, it's a permanent change in the landscape of our country. And it will, we know we've had initiative after initiative, and I think they're really important, but you know, the money comes for a certain period of time, it's invested or whatever, and it goes away. Those statues being removed from our high streets, that celebration of men who've earned their wealth, and they call it the wealth of this country, through brutal actions, need to be removed, and removed permanently. So I think it's a really good and important action. And I would say that it isn't a distraction. It's being made a distraction by the right and the media because they know they can whip up that sort of fervour of holding on to.
What a word, whip up.
I know. I wanted to go on to that.
I wanted to talk a little bit about some of those
Yeah.
as well. Go
Yeah.
on.
So there were
Like
two of the
last minute echo, yeah?
Yeah. One was, can we get into this word whip? Because it's the one thing I've found really irritating in terms of having a political life, is the fact that we still use it. We need to have a campaign. If we're going to remove statues, remove the word whip from our political life. Let's get it out there. Because it was an African, but it was also men on women. Men were illegal for them to whip their wives. So that's another point. And also, just my point, I think the story in the Caribbean needs to start actually at the point of what happened when slavery ended, because it's a very specific period of transition. And actually the oppression of Africans in the Caribbean after slavery in many ways was actually worse, because up until that point, slaves didn't live in the Caribbean. 11 months. They were bought in thousands because they died in thousands. These are small islands. So I think that is the next story, is what happened in the Caribbean, because that's where most of our cultural heritage from, at the point when slavery ended.
Yeah, no, and what I found, like, I thought I knew about slavery, but I realized that I barely know anything, and there's so much more to know, and kind of read things and you forget things. But Eric Williams is an excellent read. Dan, if you'd like to come in, and then I'm going to wrap it up because we're almost at 7, and I just wanted to leave with another contribution from Nina. So Dan, you had a thumbs up. Are you happy to speak? Because I didn't see. Yeah, hi Dan.
Hey Lucy, thank you so much for such an inspiring and enlightening talk.
Thanks for coming.
I kind of wanted to ask what yours, and maybe it'd be interesting to know actually what Diane thinks as well, being on the sort of political front bench of things, but whether there's any hope from our media, from our national media, in terms of educating people. You know, I agree, and you know, so much needs to be done in the schools, but a lot of kids kind of fall out of, you know, education, and that sort of then goes to especially working class kids, and then that points to how important our country's media is in terms of educating people. And it seems to be that since the 60s and 70s, and especially under Thatcher, the media became such an important arm of dividing, you know, divide and rule, which is sort of the original way from the imperial to colonial to sort of the capitalist mantra. But do you see any hope of mass media of playing a role in educating people of all the amazing stuff you've just told us about slavery? You know, is there any hope that they will do that?
Well, unfortunately, Diana's gone, but I have to say, as someone who does tune into the BBC to see what they're talking about, even Channel 4 News, there's already been an impact. There's already been like a kind of a bit of a wake-up call, and including, you know, a wider variety of speakers. Obviously, right now we're talking about this, but even, you know, coming across the play, that was an unused article. I think around issues on the legislation for equality and challenging structural those are the mechanisms that can enforce that onto the media. I think that you're gonna hopefully find that there's much more engagement with Black arts and things like that, because like I'm sure Echo will tell you, it's all happening. We're out there, people are doing it. It's just that it's not being embraced. So I think that this will make a bit of a difference. I think the legislation and the political and policy changes that we need to push for can help that. Obviously some media is more biased than others, but I think really and truly, like, if you think about the fastest growing threat in this country is far right propaganda, and over COVID there's been like an escalation of radicalization. So I think social media and that kind of content is something that really needs to be checked and tackled. I was in a meeting with brother Raj. We got bombed, but these were children, they were teenagers that have been nurtured to be full of hate and spite. And when you talk about Thatcher, the legacy of Thatcher and what she did, which is why for me Grace Blakeley's book kind of misses a big chunk of what Thatcher was doing. She used the state and the state apparatus to not only change the international economic ideology of the time, but she also used it to vilify, criminalize us. When 10,000 people marched to Parliament after the Deptford fire, she swamped the communities with the police. Then when the riot broke out, we got vilified, and that has never been counteracted. I was reading The Sun at 11, 12 years old and seeing what the headlines were. When I went to university and I learned about what happened, I was so shocked at how much I'd been deceived. Like, I was a kid, I didn't know. It's things like that that we need to tackle. So at an institutionalized racism level, we have to call account for the historical attack that has been put on us and be able to identify it. So for me, next year is the 40th anniversary of that incident. We really need to be raising up our voices and demanding that, you know, tackling racism, inequality has to be at the forefront. You know, like, it's not just for us, it's for everybody. But if the media doesn't come on board and it doesn't have charters and equality and we're pushing on it, then, you know, how is it going to change? But it has to change that medium, because that is one of the most powerful subliminal propaganda mechanisms that kind of establish and refound and gaslight those deep-seated thoughts about Black people. Because this is where, like, when people talk about DNA, like, if you think of the fear that was you know, imparted on people when they heard about slave rebellions and the stories that they were told. And, you know, like, when Black people came to this country, people were asking people to see their tails. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, there was like a really backward view to start off with, and then the representation over a period of time has been, it's just confounded it, and it's time to stop that. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but like, you yourself, you work in media, you work in music. It's about all of us putting in our contribution as well.
Yeah, thank you, Lucie. Yeah, it does. I mean, it sounds like, and it's interesting to hear a bit of your hope in how things are slowly, but representation is improving a little bit. It's interesting to like hear what you were talking about, sort of how the working class of Britain over the centuries, what would have been at that time predominantly white working class, you know, that they weren't winning out much from the slave trade. It was the dominating classes of power.
Definitely.
And, you know, and how sort of when News International came in, and, you know, under Thatcher, and apparently she was just so scared of the miners' strikes kind of teaming up with other working class struggles at the time, whether it was migrant rights or other things, you know, she was just so scared of that kind of solidarity happening. But yeah, thank you for the answers. It sounds like there is a bit of hope in our mass media, but, you know, I think there's a long way to go.
Thanks, Dan. I'm really glad to see you here. So we have gone over time. If you guys are patient enough, I just wanted to finish with a quick poem, and then just another track from Nina. Yeah? Okay, so what I want from reparations. Breathe in from my heart for a start, and start from the beginning. Right now, we only look backward when we should always be looking forward. Knowing our health, wealth, and spiritual well-being, being self-assured that we were leaders from the beginning, knowing what we built and what we have endured, knowing how we fought and how we have excelled, making sense of nonsense, some generational unity, our own economic community, visions of beauty will finally change and we'll love our natural beauty proudly again. Black lives will matter, forever amen, and the youth can find love and harmony again. This is the decade to call this out and really find out what capitalism is all about. Built off of slavery, blood, sweat and tears, propelling the engines of an industrial age, building the wealth with each lash on our back, and now it's time for you to give back. Give back the truth and the history you stole. Give us our props like for Mary Seacole. Take down the statues of those drenched in our blood. Dash away the bullshit books on the shelf. I want to see Africans wearing fine clothes when I look at in the books on the history of Rome. Europeans were often the slaves, but their type of slavery made them hide that away. I want the children to learn in school that everyone's history is worth a view. We fight for all humans to be free and live in an equal society. You have to teach the teachers too and those who make decisions, because if you don't know what's gone on, then you're likely to be complicit. The planet is in crisis, and all humanity. While you persist in raping mama, her son says he can't breathe. The time is now for changes. Busk the insects and the trees. We have to stop polluting our rivers and the sea. We have to be united if we want to be free. We have to stand together as one in unity. Black power. Black power is nothing to fear. It just makes fighting racism clear. Black power is having a voice that's heard. Black power is living free on this earth.